few distinct problems. One of them is that private pensions have been relatively generous in the past for those who work for a company for a long period of time. They tended to be in so-called defined benefit pension schemes, where if you work for a company for a relatively long period of time, you then have a guaranteed pension for as long as you lived, which is some fraction of the earnings that you made when you were at work. Sometimes a fraction of your final salary, which typically was the highest salary that you might get with the company. And those kind of schemes, because they've proved extraordinarily expensive for companies, partly because people have lived a lot longer over the last few decades than had seemed likely if you go back 30 or 40 or 50 years, those schemes have become so expensive that most companies, private sector companies now, have just closed them down. And so we're switching, and this has been underway for some time, to a system of so-called defined contribution pensions, where individuals build up their own pension pot. They have to decide how to invest it. They've then got investment risk. They may invest in assets that suddenly fall in value just before they retire. That risk was there in the past, but it sat with companies and not with the individual. And more than that, the typical amount of money that's going into those schemes, those defined contribution schemes, is significantly lower than was going into the defined benefit scheme. And people are on track, if we carry on this trajectory, to be getting on average significantly lower pensions down the road into the future, 30, 40, 50 years from now, much less, than was being true for people who've retired in recent decades. That's a problem. It comes, of course, one could say, well, the state is going to have to step in and provide more of the income in retirement. But then that's the second problem with the demographics, which is that the fiscal situation is challenged by an aging population, not just because of pensions, in fact, more importantly in many ways, because of health-related spending and the pressures on the NHS for an aging population.
Even if you knew what your investment return was, with no uncertainty, how you save for retirement, how much you save for retirement, and how you draw those pension savings down in retirement, both of those are really difficult questions. Ideally you'd have perfect foresight over what your housing situation is going to be, what you're going to earn, how long you're going to be able to work without health incapacity or disability, and how long you're going to live into old age. You don't know any of those. So, what do people and governments do in response? Well, unfortunately, people don't seem to change how much they save that much, or as much as you might expect as they age, or as they get a pay rise. You might expect they'll put a load of money in if they get into savings to get a pay rise, and people don't actually don't change their behaviour that quickly. Now, government has set up a set of policies, basically the path of least resistance for most employees is to save probably a little bit. And in retirement is actually, it's a free-for-all, okay? So I think kind of to take David's point here about what governments and corporations kind of putting, designing defaults and things like that, I think they have to, because to guide people in broadly sensible directions. I think once you start doing that, which the governments have started doing, there's actually an obligation to try to do that quite well, actually, and not just go, this is about all right. So I think trying to be a little bit more sophisticated on helping people most people make broadly better saving decisions and decisions on how to draw income in retirement are needed, but it's not going to be perfect for everyone.
If I may add, there's a bit of a paradox here, it seems to me. It's absolutely right that from a point of view of planning and how much do you save and when do you decumulate your pension and what kind of assets are in some sense you would like to know, when am I going to get ill, when am I going to have to stop working, and how long am I going to live? I would pay a lot of money not to know when I was going to die. I think it would be an appalling thing to know. So it's the paradox of there's forms of uncertainty that make planning difficult, but there are forms of uncertainty where if you removed them, life would just become a nightmare. there's no easy answer to that one.
Yeah. But I think a good pension system would involve good outcomes for people in working age and retirement that don't involve, don't need great foresight, and that people don't need to be financial experts or have great foresight to generate decent outcomes. If we put the growth issue to one side, which is, very hard to do actually, but if you do, and and of course growth doesn't actually fix everything if your pensions are tied to growth, or how the richer you are, the more you need to pay doctors and nurses. It doesn't quite fix everything. No. But if you put that to one side, I'd rather be in our position than Italy and France with regard to the pension system. If you're spending 13% of GDP on a pay-as-you-go system, which means that the working age are paying the current pensioners' pensions, and it's this kind of, that's what they call it, a pay-as-you-go scheme. I'd rather be in our situation than theirs. Then I think if you do have the balance of public and private pensions that we have in the UK, you kind of have a responsibility to get both of them working well. There are a lot of things to like about the UK system, not everything. I don't think there's an off-the-shelf model of we should go and do that, but I think that we can try to learn from best practice and what's working well broadly in countries like Canada, the Netherlands, to some extent the United States and Australia, as being similar countries that have roughly how they set up pensions. And I think that I actually have a degree of optimism that in the next 10 years that, put on the private pension side, that we will move towards a slightly better system with slightly higher contributions, with slightly less risk of running out of resources at the end of life.
I think when you're talking about pensions in particular, it's really important to try and understand what are the health trends, and the health trends amongst people as they move through their 50s into their 60s and 70s. Because it's easy for economists sometimes to say, well, it's obvious what the answer here is. Average life expectancy is going up. People just need to work a few more years and not retire at 60, and that needs to become 63 or 64. But until you understand a lot more than most economists know, certainly more than I know, about what is happening to the distribution of states of health amongst people as they proceed through their late 50s into their 60s and beyond into real old age, actually you're kind of coming out with policy prescriptions slightly in the dark. I think one of the great advantages of the conference, and we've heard many presentations here today from people who really do understand the health trends, some of which are very far from obvious. And until you listen to those people, and there are many people here who are working with health experts, really you're in danger of coming up with policy prescriptions on the pensions front, which are a bit simplistic and sometimes just are not going to work.
But I think that there's a degree that we need to be kind of humble, not only because we don't know everything, but because, I think there is a risk that academics study something and say they know exactly what to do, whereas, actually in our system we have democratic accountability of politicians, and I think rather than people saying this is exactly what we want to do, a really key thing, a key role is to provide great evidence to policymakers, to elected politicians who can then make reasonable trade-offs given the political constraints, but also given the kind of inherent trade-offs in policymaking. And I don't think that we should be standing up saying we know exactly what to do, because we do have a kind of democratic process that we should be trying to inform to make those decisions. I'm slightly more worried I think to some extent, if people are just choosing to have fewer children and that's what's best for them, you know, in a sense, that's fine. To the extent that there is even partial causality due to, you know, extremely high housing costs, people having small houses, you know, huge constraints in the housing sector, which feeds through into people not having as many children as they ideally would like. You know, I think that is just another symptom of the welfare losses coming from constrained housing. I think that even if you are broadly not worried about it in essence of fewer children, I think that there are going to be issues on how do you manage change in public services? How do you manage change in declining numbers of schools? How do you manage in old age that fewer people are going to have children to help them look after them in old age? How are you going to design, you know, you're going to have lots of differences in public policy where people having fewer children just changes their of course their family relationships, but then their relationships with the state. I think that we are in a bit of a better position, partly because countries who are further along this process of low fertility are coming in front of us. And I hope that we can learn from good policy, kind of, not solutions, but policy adaptations to a lower fertility system, and learn from them so that any kind of changing or growing, or it's not growing pains, maybe shrinking pains, are felt less keenly.